Today we're starting a four-part homily series on the virtue of justice. I'll go through, kind of give you a preview of the topics we're going to cover. So today we'll talk about justice and justification. Next week we'll cover God's fatherly love. The third week we'll cover justice as the way to true relationship. And the fourth week we'll cover raising happy children, justice in the way to freedom and joy. So those are the four topics. These are all going to be on our parish YouTube channel. So if you're traveling one week or something, you can, or the weather's really bad one week, then you can catch up by watching it on our parish YouTube channel. Or if you want to share it with a friend or whatever, you can always do that as well through that media means. So, the virtue of justice. Justice, a very simple definition of justice. We can expand that a little bit. The basic definition of justice is giving to others what is owed to them, what is due to them. Right? So it's giving to others what is owed to them or due to them. And justice is necessarily relational. Right? We can sort of talk about justice as rendering to ourselves what is owed to us, but it really falls short. Justice is really about a relationship with others. And so it's a condition for a real and rightly ordered relationship. One of the ways to think of justice is having a right relationship with others, with other people, with other persons, right? And with God. We have a just relationship with God. We'll get to that in a little bit. But justice is giving to others what is owed to them or due to them. Right? So in general, we'll give a few basic examples. One of the sort of very lofty applications of justice has to do with our dignity. Right? We are made in the image and likeness of God. And so that means that we have to treat each other a certain way, right? And God renders that to us as well. Right? So one of the basic tenets of having a rightly ordered relationship with others is that we recognize the dignity of others. So the principle, this is a principle of natural justice. This isn't supernaturally revealed, but that human life it has dignity and value and must be respected from conception to natural death. That is a natural principle, right? We talk about that so much in the church. We can think about it as like, oh, that must be divinely revealed. No, we know that by human reason alone. We can get to that conclusion very easily. We have inherent dignity, right? Because we are created by God. And so we have dignity as a creature. And even more so in Scripture, we hear we are made in his image and likeness, which actually you can reason to that very quickly. But that we have to uphold one another's dignity from conception to natural death. So things like how we treat others, that we don't kill them. That's not divinely revealed, right? It is part of the Decalogue, but that is a natural principle. You can reason to the fact that it is unjust to kill someone, to murder someone, right? So to take their life without a due cause, without a just cause, is unjust. And so we have to respect the dignity of the human person from conception to natural death. It's why you don't need divine revelation to understand that abortion is wrong or that murder is wrong. Right? These are very easy things to understand. But alas, our culture has struggled with that, let's say. So these are realities of justice, right? How we treat one another is a reality of justice. Do we render to one another what is owed to them, right? Our justice system in the United States, at least, is largely based very well on broad brushstrokes on true principles of justice, right? So if you kill someone, you face consequences for that. And we sort of make distinctions between what the intent was, what actually happened, right? And we mete out justice, at least on earth, for those things based on the crime that's been committed, right? So there is justice in these relationships. And even personally with other people. We can go back to thou shalt not kill, right? What does the Lord tell us? That if you even have hatred in your heart for your brother, that you've committed the sin of murder in your heart, right? Your anger has led you to that same species of that sin, a specific type of that sin, right? And so it's unjust to hate someone else, right? So the Lord points out to us that this is wrong. We should also be attentive to false justices, right? False senses of justice, or at least disordered or not true sense of justice, right? And these faults of justice, these wrong senses of justice, very easily pervade our culture, right? So the first one is self-centeredness or self-righteousness, and the other one is vengeance, right? There are other sort of ways to make offenses against the virtue of justice, to be unjust. But these are the two that I think are most common. They actually are quite related. We'll break these down just a little bit. Right? A self-centeredness or self-righteousness, that's what children have because of the effects that remain after baptism of the fall. Right? So they think the world revolves around them. That's the temptation that children have. They tend to see the world as revolving around them, and they want everyone else to pay attention only to their whatever is going on in their emotions or whatever. Right? If this isn't corrected or children aren't helped to overcome this, then they end up being adults that are self-centered. They think the world revolves around them. And you maybe have experienced this, hopefully not personally, but you maybe experienced this in others. Maybe if you have experienced this personally, you can begin to render justice to others by not being so self-centered. But it's really a rejection of others to place ourselves over others, right? So there's a pride, there's sort of a subjugation. My needs are more important than anyone else's needs, right? So that's the first way. The other is with vengeance, right? With vengeance, right? Now, vengeance, the classical definition of vengeance is actually part of one of the things that comes from justice. Vengeance is giving to others what is owed to them for the evil they have done, right? So there is a sort of rendering justice to them. But vengeance in the sort of disordered sense, and the way we commonly use it in our conversation, is sort of like that temptation to mob justice or to take justice into our own hands, right? There's a lot of times is conditioned on anger, right? So there's this desire to mete out justice ourselves, right? And that because we've been wronged, we owe someone something else in justice, and we're going to take it out of them, right? Or take it out on them, you might say. And this usually has kind of two ways that this works out. Either it's based on an untrue injustice. We think we've been done wrong, but we actually haven't. There's actually, what happened was not particularly unjust. But we just feel it's unjust, usually because we're self-centered and we kind of think we're owed something that we're not, right? So, simple example, someone takes the last chocolate in the Russell Stover box, right? And you were really hoping for that chocolate. And it's wrong that someone took that chocolate. I am angry at them, and I'm going to take it out on them. The next time I see them, I'm going to yell at them, right? You weren't really owed that chocolate. So just newsflash, you weren't owed the chocolate. If there's no strict, unless someone promised you the chocolate and then they ate it, right? It's not unjust, right? You actually probably are better off for not eating the chocolate. Just let's be real. But then there's also this disordered response. So even if there is a real injustice, there can be a disordered response that calls for vengeance, right? And this is actually being particularly highlighted in Georgia right now, and in Atlanta, where this officer was, these officers did whoever knows what they did, right? They're still sorting that out. We don't really know. But there can be a disordered response to an injustice, right? It's not because someone else did something wrong doesn't give you the right to damage other people's property or light police cars on fire or whatever you're going to do, right? So there's a disordered response to an injustice, right? And so this plays out in our day-to-day life, right? Think about when hopefully this doesn't happen to you, but let's say you're driving, you're getting on the belt line, right? And it's kind of a lot of traffic, and you're trying to merge onto the belt line, and no one lets you in. Temptation to think is to get angry, right? No one's letting me in, and I have to deal with the, get that, and maybe want to point at that person or use another finger. And that's, there, it's possible that the person's like, I'm not letting you on, but you have no idea really of knowing that, right? And it's possible that, they couldn't merge over or it was unsafe to do so, or there could be all a host of reasons. But because of our self-centeredness and our desire to get sort of vengeance, we can get very angry about that sort of a thing and say and do unkind things, even in the silence of our own cars. It's kind of a silly thing that we get so angry and yell in our own vehicle. No one else can hear us besides the good Lord, who's kind of ashamed and offended that we do that. So these are little ways that we can turn to these things that are unjust, these self-centeredness, self-righteousness, and vengeance. One of the ways that we should be very careful of, and just mention this as a little bonus false justice, is when people say, sometimes people use this phrase, it's kind of a silly phrase. By silly, I mean kind of dumb. This term social justice, right? Social justice is by nature social, right? Because we live in communities, and so there has to be justice. If we're going to have a rightly ordered community, we have to have justice, right? There's just justice. That's all. Sometimes we refer to it as communal justice when we're trying to highlight something that belongs to community, right? The particular way of aspect of justice that as it applies to a community. But the classic way we talk about that is communal justice, right? That we talk about it as regards a community. But this term social justice, I'm pointing it out just because we should be aware when people use that word that there are a lot of times are underlying agendas. Sometimes they're political, they don't necessarily have to be, but there's sort of another goal that's being aimed at besides justice. It doesn't have to happen. The church uses this term in some of the translations of her what we call the social teaching, right? So teaching on society, on community life. But it's more classically termed as communal justice. We should just be, when we hear that term social justice, we should just be a little like, I wonder if there's something else that's underlying this that isn't really justice, it's some other agenda that's being termed as justice. So just a little warning there. The last aspect of justice that we should think about, and this really brings it close to home in our relationship with the Lord, is the doctrine of justification. Right? When we think of the doctrine of justification, St. Paul is the one who oftentimes uses this kind of language, or at least it's translated this way. And this happens in today's readings. We'll get to that in a little bit with the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, first letter, St. Paul to the Corinthians. So let's back up a little bit. Injustice, with regards to God, comes into the world with original sin. And so in the beginning, we are in right relationship with God. Adam and Eve, and so therefore the whole of the human race, has a rightly ordered relationship with God. We rely on God to sustain us. He created us. He's our creator. He loves us. We're made in his image and likeness. We live in justice, in communion with him because of the way that we relate to him. We follow Adam and Eve, before the fall, followed his ways. They relied on him. All these sorts of things that conditioned their original relationship with God. But in the fall, they turned away from God. So they not only offended God, we talk about that in that sort of ways, but they rendered an injustice to God that separated them from God. They had a disordered relationship with God. So their relationship with God was not right. And therefore, by extension, the whole of the human race had turned away from God, had been separated from God in the fall. So there's an injustice that needs to be righted in the fall. And so, but the Lord promises that he will right it. And only he can right it. Right? Only God can repair the damage. Why? Because the offense that we've given to God cannot be made right by us. Right? We are at an eternal disadvantage Right? We have no way of rendering to God what is owed to God, which is to pay the eternal debt. None of us are eternal, and so none of us can pay the debt. So we are in this situation, this seemingly hopeless situation, except for the fact that God promises, out of his infinite love for us, that he will redeem us, that he will do the work of redemption, of making right, of justifying us, making us right before God in relation to him. He will bring us back to himself. And so he promises Adam and Eve that that will happen. And throughout the whole history of the Old Testament, the Lord makes covenants. He enters into a relationship with the people of Israel that is directed and prefigures the true, perfect relationship that he desires to have with us. He promises that we will be his people, and that he will, if we are faithful to him, he will restore us. And now he knows we're going to struggle with this. He knows that this is the reality, but he calls us time and time again to this relationship. He slowly, throughout the Old Testament, draws us into this, back into this relationship, reveals himself to us who have been separated from him by sin. And when the fullness of time comes, he sends his Son, right? The eternal Son, who takes on our human flesh. So God takes on what is broken. He takes on us. He becomes man to make us right with him. And he pays the eternal debt by suffering and dying. What is owed to God, right? The only way that we could even think of trying to restore that relationship is by sacrificing ourselves, offering ourselves back to God. But because we're sinful and broken by sin, we can't do that. So God takes on our flesh, the Son takes on our flesh, and he who is perfect offers the perfect sacrifice. Man offered to God, but the perfect man, who necessarily is God. And Jesus Christ makes us right with the Father. And so when St. Paul says, and he uses a number of different terms that refer to this doctrine of justification, right? Today he says, it is due to him that you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, as well as righteousness, sanctification, and redemption. Those three terms, righteousness, sanctification, and redemption, refer to justification, that Christ makes us right with God. He makes right the relationship that is disordered. He makes us right with the Father. And so, and he doesn't just sort of like, okay, we're going to sort of like just cover it all up and make it sort of seem right, an external sort of making it right. But he actually removes the disorder that's in us. When we're baptized, we are sanctified. We are made just. We are justified. Right? God pours his justice into us. Right? We die to the disorder that is in us from sin. Sin is washed away, and we are made right with God. So we have a right relationship with God. And this differs from, namely, and we don't always understand these things. This is why I want to point it out. And I will admit that this is a gross simplification. Right? So if you want to get into the doctrine of justification and how it differs from the Protestant understanding of justification, that's a big topic. Right? Like homilies upon homilies to be given on that. We're not going to go into it. But when Luther says that we are like a dunghill that covered in snow, right? That is inherently opposed to the way that we understand how God actually justifies us. Right? God removes sin in us. Right? He doesn't just cover it up. He just doesn't sort of like, let's put a tablecloth over this, ugly. It's like when you have someone over to your house and you're like, I don't have time to clean the room, so I'm just going to take all the junk and throw it in a closet and we'll just close the door. God doesn't do that with our sins, right? He actually rightly orders and removes the disorder, the sin that's in us. So we are actually just. right? We're not just covered over. We don't just appear that we've been made right with God, but sin is actually removed. And so we are made right with God. This is why it's so necessary that we come to the sacrament of confession. Because when we sin again, right, when we turn back to sin, which we have a tendency towards, right, that we have to have that sin removed. And so confession, especially for mortal sins, is the way that that happens. There are other ways that the Lord can forgive venial sins, but primarily it's the sacrament of confession, which is why we should go often. Because if we turn back to sin and we personally commit sin, then we are unjust again. We put ourselves back in that place of being separated from God. Right? So we have to turn back to God through the sacrament of confession. And this is the beauty of what the Lord wants for us. He doesn't just want to sort it all out, but without us. Right? He actually loves us. And so he wants the perfection that's in him to be in us. Right? He actually wants us to be made right with him. He doesn't want it to just appear like it's right. And sometimes people fall into thinking that they can, if I only have a couple sins that I really am sensitive to, or I'm generally a good person, right? The fallacy of the good person, that it's all okay. And it doesn't really apply to me. No. The Lord actually wants us to have a right relationship with us, with him, because he wants us to be close to him. And he doesn't just want to sort of make it all okay on the surface. He wants to have a deep and abiding communion with us. So he wants his justice, his justification, his ordering our lives, our hearts, our whole person to him to be entirely encompassing. So this is why our response is so necessary. God can't save us without us. We have to choose to turn back to God. Right? This is why the sort of common understanding of this faith alone saves is so damaging, because it sort of exempts us, or at least it can give us the impression that if it's misunderstood, which is oftentimes the way that Protestant theology has tended, is that it doesn't sort of require us to make a response, or at least our response is sort of very much secondary, right? Yes, the Lord has to do the heavy lifting, but his grace has to actually be at work in us. And so we have to respond. We have to choose to respond to the love and the mercy that the Lord has offered us. That the right relationship that the Lord has invited us to, we're actually responding to. And so we have to respond. Our response is necessary. Right? It's not enough for us to just respond. God has to do the work. But we also need to respond to the Lord. The Lord can't save us without us. So the Lord wants this right relationship with us. He wants us to have it with one another. He wants us to have it with him. We should pay close attention to the virtue of justice. Right? What is false justice? What is true justice? And that the Lord has made us just. Right? He begins the good work in us, and he brings it to completion. But we also have to cooperate with that good work that he is doing in us. Next week, we'll look at God's fatherly love, how he loves us through justice, and how he reveals himself and draws us close to himself through that virtue of justice. Look forward to this unfolding. It's all going to wrap up before Lent, so it might be a good way to prepare for Lent, to think about the sacrifices, the penances that the Lord wants for you to draw close to him during Lent. Looking forward to all of it. Like I said, this will be on YouTube if you want to review it or share it with someone else, or if you miss it. Looking forward to all of this.